Joining me now, we have Jeff Mason, White House correspondent with Reuters, and Michael Feinberg, former FBI Assistant Special Agent in Charge, now Senior Editor at Lawfare, and MS Now National Security and Intelligence Analyst. Welcome to both of you guys. So, Jeff, what are you hearing about this new Washington Post report that 1,500 active duty troops are being prepared for possible deployment to Minnesota? And how serious is the president about invoking the Insurrection Act?
Well, one thing I've certainly learned as a reporter who covers President Trump, and I think this country has learned from his second term in particular, but also his first 4 years in office, is you have to take President Trump seriously when he says something. So I think that's the answer to your question, Alex. People should take it seriously because when he says things like that, he means it. That said, he has backed away from it a little bit since the initial threat and said more recently that he doesn't need to do it now, but he will do it if he'll basically keep that tool in his toolbox. And as far as troops being prepared, I mean, I think that the confirmation that White House officials apparently have given, saying that the Pentagon is always ready, is a sign that they're always ready. And they also know, the people who work for the president in the Pentagon, certainly starting with the Secretary of Defense or Secretary of War, he knows that they have to be ready when an order like that could come. So just to go back to what I said initially, it's not just journalists and citizens who need to take it seriously when the president says something like that. It's his people and his staff and his inner circle as well.
So, Michael, the Post reports officials characterizing the Pentagon's prepare to deploy orders as, quote, prudent planning. So even if it turns out to be just a planning step, does this represent a major escalation by the administration? Under what circumstances would a federal government plan to deploy active duty soldiers against American protesters be considered legal?
Under the Insurrection Act, that is the only mechanism by which I can see the president doing this lawfully. But as we know from his first term and the first year of this term, the requirement that something be done lawfully may not be the handbrake that it has been for other administrations. What we are seeing is an unprecedented escalation in American history of the use of military forces potentially to subdue a civilian population which is not accused of doing anything wrong whatsoever and is simply exercising their First Amendment rights. This is a Rubicon that once we cross could very well have deleterious consequences.
So, but Michael, so yes, the president could invoke the Insurrection Act, but is there a bar at which the president must meet or exceed before doing so legally?
The Insurrection Act itself is not very specific, like many of our provisions of the Constitution or laws dating from the early years of this country. It's written in generalities. There was always an assumption that there were going to be certain norms and virtues among our leadership that would not make spelling out every single situation necessary. So under the Act, he probably has more latitude than most people are comfortable with. And under recent Supreme Court precedents, there's not a lot of consequences if he oversteps. So if I was part of Minnesota's state leadership or Minneapolis's city government, I'd be considerably concerned about this step.
Well, in fact, this, Michael, sets up a potential showdown in Minnesota because it comes after Governor Walz mobilized the National Guard to prepare to support state and local agencies. But here's what former Trump White House counsel Ty Cobb said today. Let's watch this.
I think martial law is definitely in the cards, and it's a way that he'll be able to control, the elections. I will say that Governor Walz, in terms of activating the National Guard and having them stage and assemble, Yeah, I'm fine with that, but deploying them actually to the streets is playing into Trump's game. And deploying them into the streets invites the confrontation that, frankly, legally they need in order to lawfully invoke the Insurrection Act, and they don't have it right now.
Do you agree, Michael? What stands out to you about that?
I disagree that Minnesota and its politicians and leaders are the ones playing into Trump's hands and instigating him. There is no reason for ICE to be there in the first place in the numbers that they currently are, nor is there any reason for them to be acting and behaving in the way they are. What they are doing is well beyond the pale, well beyond the norms of any standard law enforcement practice. And if you are a public servant responsible to the citizens of that city and that state, at a certain point, you have to do something to protect them. So they're really in a no-win situation. If they do nothing, they're failing in their duty to their constituents. If they themselves try and do something to protect those constituents, they'll be accused of playing into Trump's hands, and Trump will escalate. It's not an enviable position for any leader.
So, Jeff, Kristi Noem is out today defending the officer who shot and killed protester Renee Good. But the latest polls show voters souring on immigration. You've got 61% who say ICE is too tough, 58 and 61% disapproving of Trump's handling of immigration. What are you hearing behind the scenes about how the White House views the way Kristi Noem is managing this?
Well, I think so far that President Trump has made clear that he's a big fan of Secretary Noem. And I think having his DHS secretary come out and be combative is exactly the type of cabinet member that he's looking for, and exactly the kind of performance that he's looking for. Let's be clear. What she is saying is also certainly in line with what Vice President Vance has said from the White House podium. And it is the administration's view that that this was done lawfully and that this was okay. Now, to the second part of what you said, Alex, the polling has got to be concerning for a White House that is certainly now thinking a lot about the midterm elections, which are coming up later this year. And the president was elected, at least in part, on his promises for what he wanted to do on immigration. And I don't see that the polling really delineates the differences between Republicans and Democrats and independents on this issue. But the broader public is losing confidence in what ICE is doing and in the president's immigration policies. And that's not a good position politically for him or for Republicans going into an election year.
Yeah. Michael, you wrote about the Minnesota statute for lawfare. Is the law clear on what should be taking place in Minnesota right now?
I'm going to answer a slightly different question, in that the law is very clear as to what should not be happening right now. As far as we can tell from all the footage that has been released and from all the statements coming from people like Secretary Noem or Vice President Vance, ICE is just sort of roaming around the city, doing things that would normally be the purview of state and local law enforcement. Renee Good, as near as I can tell, the only thing she can plausibly be accused of is temporarily blocking traffic. That is not a federal offense. If the ICE officers were trying to actually execute some sort of warrant or do something for which they have statutory authority and she was actively stopping them, they can certainly make an effort to remove her from the scene. But there's a professional way to do that, and there are standardly accepted practices that would help you. They didn't do any of that. They rushed to her car, screaming and cursing in language I would blush to use in public society, immediately escalating to trying to get hands on her and ripping her out of the passenger compartment. And we saw what happened. There were multiple steps where they could have de-escalated. There were multiple steps where they could have taken a better cause of action from a tactical perspective, and they didn't. and now a wife and mother is dead.